How you doing, eh? What's up, my hosers? Shout out to Bob and Doug McKenzie and all kinds of strange brew. Looks like my friends up north are having some problems. I would certainly toss my hat, or rather toque, into the ring, but let's see what's actually happening behind the specifics of this issue. As this is a large, in some ways international issue, there's probably use in trying to bring some degree of rational understanding into what is happening. With that said, buckle up. Nail that double clutch. Watch out for Smokey. Teach that baby bear who he's messing with. And don't bother with the chicken coop. Pedal to the metal. We're taking a ride. Over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle defined a first principle as the first basis from which a thing is known. We have heard lots of people discuss this idea, and have seen some great progress in many areas due to it. Let's then borrow from Aristotle and see where we end up. The first principle in this case seems to be the fact that humans are a social species. Most seem to prefer to group with others, which has helped us greatly over at least the last tens of thousands of years. Sharing burdens, discoveries, and joys have not only advanced us in all the ways which we have improved, but also have helped us cope with destruction, loss, and many trials that life has presented and continues to present us with. This is where we hit our first problem. How are we supposed to work together when we all have different thoughts, ideas, and opinions? There have been a great many answers to this question throughout the years. This is known as the subject of political philosophy, and indeed, sure to be a big surprise, epistemology. It is certainly not my intention to go through the bulk of political philosophy in any way. It is a monster. Let us rather assume, perhaps incorrectly, that democracy is, in some way, the correct answer to this question. For those who disagree with democracy, I welcome the arguments and ideas in the comments below. Back to the question then. How do we get a group of individuals to act as a single entity, assuming democracy, where people have the power? We're going to really need to make some laws or rules which all people in our group will adhere to. So we have a choice. We could start with everything being illegal and then take the silly ones away. For example, we start with walking being illegal, and then the people say, no, actually, walking is something we think should not be illegal. After discussion and debate, walking becomes legal. In this method, we must argue why something should not be a law. Please provide evidence and argumentation as to why walking should not be illegal. Or, we start with nothing being illegal, and then we make some things illegal. For example, we start with murder being acceptable. Then the people say, no, actually, murder is something we think is wrong, at which time murder becomes illegal. In this case, then, we must argue why something should be a law. Please provide evidence and argumentation as to why murder should be illegal. I'd like to think the former is the obvious weaker position, while the latter is the better choice, if that is disagreeable. Comments? From my point of view, we should maximize freedom and then argue for restrictions, as opposed to maximizing restrictions and then arguing for freedoms. So then, societies theoretically start with all things being allowed, but very quickly, people in the societies start seeing examples of things they think are wrong or unhelpful. And so the society creates laws against those things. And we found problem number 2. By what right do I tell a murderer that murder is wrong, when the murderer thinks it's perfectly fine? People throughout history have used a great many methods to solve this problem. Religion, opinion, dictatorial fiat, ruler's decree, and a host of others. At any rate, it seems we have a choice. We can tell the murderer that murder is wrong, or we can try to convince the murderer that murder is wrong. If we simply tell the murderer that it is wrong, the murderer will still hold his views. They will only be aware that they're not supposed to do it. The better option, then, is to try to convince the murderer that murder is wrong. In this fashion, the murderer will no longer be a murderer, as they will think that murder is wrong. We are either able to do that, or not. In either case, what we're actually saying here is the following. If you want to be in our group, you need to follow our laws. This is the other side of the freedom coin, laws, or perhaps responsibility. You can be 100% free, but to do so, you would need to live alone in a cabin in the woods. In order to live in a society, you are compelled to follow the laws of that society. So, we're left with a balancing act. This is what democratic societies are, a balancing act of freedom versus responsibility. This is where, and indeed why, protest is vital to a democracy. The people use the concept of protest to further their points of view, if they feel the balance is off in some areas. Some acts during protests are and should be deemed unacceptable, whereas others should, I would argue, be seen as acceptable. Each society has to decide for itself which protest actions are acceptable and which are not. In all cases, however, different groups, societies, countries do this balancing act differently, and this is a big reason we see differing laws in differing countries. So what we're looking for, then, is agreement. We want to agree to these laws or responsibilities in order to feel like we fit in our societies. We really only have one good way to reach this agreement by everyone: open, honest dialogue. I need to convince you that I'm correct about murder being wrong. Commanding that it is, or saying some cloud daddy told me it is, or not caring how you feel about murder, are not methods that will get you, or indeed many, on my side. Convincing you that murder is wrong with reasonable, dispassionate arguments is the most reliable way to get you to understand the simple fact that if we let you kill people, then we have to let others kill you. Perhaps there's a problem here. Although it's hopefully obvious, we're not only talking about murder here. Murder is only an example to show the point about laws. We want as many people as possible to agree with us about our rules. In this fashion, we can be most assured that all of our people think our laws are good and just. If individuals believe that our laws are just, they're less likely to break those laws. Summarizing then, we are individuals who prefer to live and prosper in groups. These groups necessarily limit our freedoms by imposing laws. These laws are cumulative, but the goal is to have few, as freedom is important to all. It is in everyone's best interest to have all members of our groups agree to these laws. The best method of having individuals agree to anything is having honest dialogue with facts and evidence. So, is this what we're doing? Hell no! We are instead breaking off into our little groups and demonizing the other side. It doesn't matter if we're speaking about Canada, the US, or really anywhere. We are right. You're evil. We don't have to deal with your thoughts because we're right. Now, the $100 million question. That's not going to happen. Which side am I referring to? Congratulations if you got it right. I'm not only referring to all sides, but also all disputes. Power, money, self-interest, lazy thinking, lack of compassion, and simple old-fashioned ignorance. I was engaged by a theist the other day who wanted to talk about truth, but was unwilling to accept the burden of proof for his claims. This is kindergarten stuff. I feel that I post the definition of philosophy in almost all of my videos. Let's slow down a bit and look at it. It is important. Philosophy is the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence. Look, if you've never studied math, why should I listen to you when talking about numbers? If you've never studied biology, why should I listen to you when speaking about the sea plague? If you've never studied knitting, why should I listen to you about knit 1, purl 2? Now take this same understanding and apply it to philosophy, the first principle of all other subjects. If you've never studied philosophy, why should I listen to you when you speak about knowledge, reality, or existence? For the quicker among you out there, you've already got it. Everything we talk about is related to knowledge, reality, or existence. Be it how to fix a car, knit a sweater, the best thing to do about a tyrannical leader, or whether the leader is actually tyrannical or not. All of these topics, and indeed every important topic, are topics one cannot speak intelligently on until one has at least a basic grasp of how philosophy works. But most people don't seem to notice this. My opinion is as valid as yours. No, it isn't. Opinions that are not backed up by rational argumentation and evidence are not valid at all. A bold claim, to be sure. People who are at the very top of the proverbial food chain. People who are very well educated in some areas. People others look to for support and indeed guidance. There are people like this who are unable to think rationally? Impossible, you say. I need evidence of your claim. I hear you shouting. Well, thanks. That's the perfect response. I present to you the leader of Canada.
The protest groups have called for a sit down with your government. They've called for negotiations. They've obviously called for an end to mandates. Is there any scenario in which you'd be willing to negotiate with these protesters to have them leave?
We will remain steadfast to the mandate given to parliamentarians 6 months ago in the last election. You will remember that there were very, very clear differences of opinion around mandatory vaccination, around vaccine mandates put forward in that election, and they were heavily debated and indeed protested by some of the main people who are same people who are protesting right now in Ottawa. And the commitment that we made as a government, if we got reelected, is we would stand by science. We would continue to do what it takes to protect people through this pandemic. Vaccinated, that federal public servants be fully vaccinated, move forward with vaccine mandates in federally regulated areas. That is the promise we made to Canadians. That is the decision Canadians took in the last election by voting for parties that were supporting those mandates. So having a group of people who disagree with the outcome of an election, who want to go a different way and bring in an alternative government, is a non-starter in a responsible democracy. That is why we are continuing to fulfill the responsibility that the Canadians gave us in this last election.
Let's quickly combine that mess. The mandates from 6 months ago were voted for, so must stay. Disagreements 6 months ago are the same as the current ones. We follow the science. Responsible democracies would do the same. Trudeau is suggesting that in a country where the people have the power, responsible democracies should not listen to the people, but rather stick by their decision from the past. He has said that he follows the science, and yet is unwilling to consider changing mandates on a scientific topic from 6 months ago due to being democratic and following the science democratically. What we have here is a failure to communicate. Some people you just can't reach. So you get what they had there for a couple weeks, which is what Canada seems to want. Well, it gets. I don't like it any more than you may. What we are News outlets the world over were and are not trying to convince or perhaps more accurately educate citizens on what the virus is, the actual lethality of it, how to effectively prevent it, etc. Instead, they were, and are, attempting to use authority. Much like how some talk to children. Don't touch the stove. Do your homework. Clean your room. Sure, I can get a kid to do their homework when I'm in the room. I've told them to do it, and they don't want to get punished. However, if I want them to do their homework when I'm not in the room, I would need them to understand why doing their homework is important. If I could get them to understand this, then they will not only do their homework when I'm in the room, but also when I'm not. This seems to me to be what the major news outlets have done. They've told us to do our homework. As expected, some kids did their homework, and some didn't. Those that didn't do their homework were called names, made to stand in the corner, and perhaps even kicked out of the school. Trudeau is doing the same. He's grouping the kids who have done their homework and then calling them Canadians. He's grouped the kids who didn't do their homework as well, and you've probably heard what he calls them. This is the problem of tribalism, and it is supported every single time anyone taunts another for wearing a mask, or, of course as well, every single time one calls the protesters horrible names. We're not only supporting this tribalism, we're creating it every day. Aside from the obvious problem with putting people in groups like this, as Whoopi could... Ooh, never mind, she doesn't know a damn thing about this. As most people could point out, this has been done by horrible people throughout history. To move away from the obvious example, take a look at Japanese internment camps, slavery, or even the treatment of natives in Canada now and throughout Canada's history. But aside from that obvious and terrible stance, there exist other problems. We're not children. Perhaps some are fine with the notion that they have to do whatever their prime minister, president, boss, or leader tells them to. But now we're back to almost all atrocities ever carried out by groups throughout history. So what is to be done? Well, sorry to point it out, Canada, but this is a problem of your own making. If some of your citizens, or citizens of any country, are poorly educated, who would be to blame? Just to point out, philosophy is not taught in Canada prior to university, and in the case of many university degrees, is not taught at all. You have citizens who have not learned about science well, just like in most countries. This is why they say things that are obviously ignorant of science. The bulk of your citizens have not learned philosophy well, or at all. This is why we're seeing the lack of decent argument and indeed conversation. You're telling them what to do, instead of educating them on the issue. And you're surprised when some of them disagree. Yes. Shocking. We have people on one side arguing for mandates without making actual arguments. People are dying. This is not an argument. People die from all sorts of things, from slipping in the bathtub to falling off their roofs. We want to protect people for sure, but we must see the difference between making laws to protect people from choking on a beaver tail and having laws to prevent murder. There exists a continuum. What the pro-mandate people need to be doing is making arguments as to why the mandates need to be in place, as opposed to appeal to emotion fallacies. Give them some data. Show the results of not enforcing the law. Contrast that with enforcing the law. Convince them. We need to protect others. Again, a claim, not an argument. How should I protect others? How effective is this protection? How dangerous is the problem? Should I always protect others in every example? You have to make your case, instead of calling people who disagree bad names. Those on the other side are arguing for freedom, but they aren't making their case in a clear way either. We want freedom. We want freedom. What they're saying takes us all the way back to the beginning of my video. We start with no laws and work our way up. Some had said these laws, or mandates, were a good idea and were temporary. Although all went along with these regulations for quite some time, some now think it's time for these mandates to end. You've not convinced them otherwise. This is what the truckers are rallying against. Mandates they do not think are effective. They would prefer freedom from these mandates. That neither makes them anarchists nor traitors who want to overthrow the government. It just makes them unconvinced of the effectiveness of these mandates. But no one is trying to convince them. People are either joining or harshly berating them. They want it to end. You want it to continue. I want to hear arguments from both sides so the people can make the best choice for their country going forward. If you claim the truth has been found, you have nothing to fear from hearing false ideas, but you do have a chance to correct them. Sounds pretty useful to me. I'll stop walking when you can show me that walking is wrong. You've not yet shown me it's wrong. I want my freedom to walk. Or, getting away from the silly example, you've not yet convinced them that the mandates are still useful. They want their freedom from the mandates. All of those who care more about laws which have no merit than personal freedom and liberty should probably re-examine their priorities. So, do the mandates still have merit or not? I have my opinions. You have yours. We may agree or not. But as almost always is the point, we're not going to get anywhere because we're not following the only method, which we know can reliably solve disputes fairly. Open, honest conversation. The truckers and their supporters seem to want to talk. Trudeau seems to want to divide and call names. The truckers want what they are calling their freedom. Trudeau seems to want to apply greater restrictions to freedom of speech, assembly, and protests in this case. Canada, like every single society that has ever been formed, has every ability to make their own laws, hopefully based on the desires and ideas of the individuals who make up that society. So, Canadians, what would you like to do? Whatever you decide is, of course, perfectly fine. So long as you're arguing and debating which course of action is best, you will have the greatest unity and trust in the laws that you create. It should also be noted, however, that you, Canada, also fit into another society yourself. A society, I would argue, is much more important than your own. You also fit into our world society, that group of all humans. Although this particular society is not what I would call well-formed yet, I do hope it will coalesce in the future, but certainly not in the way that many are pushing for nowadays. At any rate, that new society will also get to make its laws. Myself, for one, would not let the Canada that we have recently seen into this new society, nor China, nor, well, Russia, nor a great many other countries. The reason for this is simple. When we're coming up with these laws for our society, if everyone is not involved, if the pros and cons of this or that idea are not fully understood and discussed by those involved, well, what you have is not only a failure to communicate, it's worse. It's an authoritarian system. So what's it going to be? Who should have the power, and how will that power be controlled? You've got the puck. Are you going to play with the rest of Canada, Trudeau? Or are you going to take it home with you? Spoiler alert, buddy. People can always go get another puck, and you will be left home alone holding a piece of rubber. I certainly do not know Trudeau's motives, but he must have been under incredible pressure given the blockades at the borders. Perhaps the relationships between the politicians and the economy, as seen in each country's specific political structures, is the problem. Look, a very quick and very easy take here. I'm not sure there are many millionaires, or indeed billionaires, who are in touch with the people enough to govern them effectively. And more importantly to my point, I don't think politicians should have jobs that turn them into millionaires. If both of these ideas are correct, and they certainly may not be, well, then it would seem that a rich politician, any rich politician, has probably shown themselves unfit as a politician. Perhaps this is a fundamental problem with the systems in most countries worldwide. Most, probably too much of the power is wrapped up in capitalism. Business is power, instead of with the people, where democracy points to power being. Of course, as long as you have people who are unable to have calm, honest conversations, as well as people who are only interested in being right and name-calling any of those who disagree, I fear we will never see the end of this sort of thing. Some people you just can't reach. You may or may not know a very special Canadian, someone I personally really respected. He, tragically, passed away several years back. Certainly one of the hippest Canadians to ever aim at a urinal puck. They had a show at a high school gym where Gord said, "Our nation is only as good as how we treat our most vulnerable, as how we respond to those most in pain." I certainly do not want to rank pain hierarchies here. I just want to ask two questions. How do you know if someone is in pain if you don't talk to them? And how are you going to help if you're unwilling to listen?